Well, my sermon this morning may sound a little bit familiar to some of you, and that is because I delivered the beginning of this sermon at our church's annual Olino camping retreat a couple of years ago. But in revising the sermon for today, I ended up going in a very different direction, so even if you have already heard the first half of this sermon, I encourage you to stick around. Something to show you this morning. This right here, this is very special. This belongs to my 4-year-old daughter, Adia. This is her penguin, and Adia loves this penguin. She loves it so much that she actually wrote a song about it. Would you like to hear it? Yes. Sure, of course. It goes like this. You are the penguin, you are the penguin, you are the penguin, and I love you. Adia has several toys that she loves. Several. Many more after Christmas. She has several stuffed animals that she adores, but only this one makes her heart sing. If I were to ask you today to make a list of the people, places, and things that you love in life, I'm sure that each one of us could put together a pretty good-sized list. But I'm going to guess that there's only one, maybe two things on that list that truly make your heart sing, that make you feel alive in a way that nothing else can, that brings you into an awareness of your connection to the rest of creation, that brings you face to face with the divine, however you understand that term. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian tradition, and within that particular conservative tradition, I was taught about the concept of worship. My teachers and pastors taught me that the highest form of worship was direct adoration of God, often expressed through prayers or songs of praise, leading to the ultimate end or goal of said worship, divine union. But this path to divine union, this path of worship, it required debasing myself. And this debasing often included both an external and an internal expression, both a physical and a spiritual expression. Physically debasing myself, often by lowering myself to some symbolically subordinate position, perhaps on my knees or prostrate on my face, and spiritually debasing myself by confessing myself to be a sinner, absolutely unworthy of the love and blessings of God, so wicked and depraved in my nature that I deserved to spend an eternity literally burning in the fires of hell, completely incapable of earning God's favor, dependent solely on his irresistible grace to impart any value or justification to my very existence. Over time, my views on what constitutes worship, they've changed. And these views began changing long before I ever realized I was a Unitarian Universalist. One of the first epiphanies I had about worship occurred while I was taking a poetry class as a sophomore in college. See, there was this poem. Now, at the time, back in college, when I first read it, I thought it was the craziest thing that I had ever read, and I could not fathom why it appeared in a college textbook that I assumed was meant to be a compendium of the greatest, most brilliant examples of poetry that the human mind had ever composed over the course of history. This so-called poem looked like the ravings of a lunatic. And indeed, I later discovered that this 18th century English poem was, in fact, written by an inmate in an insane asylum. So these words were written literally by a man judged to be insane by his society. This fact, of course, made it that much easier to disregard his words, but the words stuck with me. And in time, I came to suspect that this insane poem might actually be the most compelling description of the highest form of worship imaginable. With your indulgence, I'd like to read an excerpt from this poem. It's entitled, "For I Will Consider My Cat Jeffrey" by Christopher Smart. For I will consider my cat Jeffrey, for he is the servant of the living God, duly and daily serving him. For at the first glance of the glory of God in the east, he worships in his way. For this is done by wreathing his body 7 times round with elegant quickness. For then he leaps up to catch the musk, which is the blessing of God upon his prayer. For he looks upon his forepaws to see if they are clean. For he sharpens his paws by wood. For he washes himself. For he flees himself, that he may not be interrupted upon the beat. For he rubs himself against a post. For he goes in quest of food. For if he meets another cat, he will kiss her in kindness. For when he takes his prey, he plays with it to give it a chance. For he has the subtlety and hissing of a serpent, which in goodness he suppresses. For he will not do destruction if he is well fed. Neither will he spit without provocation. For he purrs in thankfulness when God tells him he's a good cat. For he is the cleanest in the use of his forepaws of any quadruped. For he is the quickest to his mark of any creature. For he is a mixture of gravity and waggery. For there is nothing sweeter than his peace when at rest. For there is nothing brisker than his life when in motion. For the divine spirit comes about his body to sustain it. For he can fetch and carry. For he can jump over a stick. For he can jump into his master's bosom. For he can catch a cork and toss it again. For he camels his back to bear the first notion of business. For by stroking him I have found electricity. For God has blessed him in the variety of his movements. For though he cannot fly, he is an excellent clamberer. For his motions upon the face of the earth are more than any other quadruped. For he can swim for life. For he can creep. This is worship. Geoffrey the cat truly is a servant of the living God. And what form does his worship take? Simply stated, being a cat. Doing all the things a cat does, being true to his nature, living authentically. This is worship. Now, we, of course, we are not cats. So what is our highest form of worship? An answer I might propose this morning is this: being human, being true to our nature. The great and sad irony is that we humans have managed to create a world that often pulls us away from our own humanity, both as individuals and as a community. In fact, we have been pulled so far away from our core, from our source, we've become so alienated from our true and authentic selves, we now struggle to remember. We must struggle even to ask ourselves the question, what exactly does it even mean to be human? Part of the difficulty in answering this question is our inability to approach the question with any measure of objectivity. See, the problem is we're all human, so we all have that inherent human bias. Can't really see the water we swim in. The closest thing to an objective answer we could find on the subject would have to come from a non-human source. But unfortunately, despite the best attempts of Russian and American space travelers, we have yet to meet an intelligent extraterrestrial being who could provide us the answer that we seek. But I'm not giving up on this search for an objective answer to the question of what it means to be human. In the absence of actual aliens to help us with this question, I will appeal to the next best thing: humans pretending to be aliens. Humans looking at humanity through the imaginary lens of extraterrestrial species. This is what the literary genre of science fiction does so well. Sci-fi is what allows us to grapple with the question, what does it mean to be human? Now, I know what some of you may be thinking, that now I'm going to go back to Star Wars for this sermon. But you're wrong, even though it might be a smart marketing decision to do so. You see, Star Wars doesn't answer or even ask this question about the nature of humanity. And that's because Star Wars isn't really science fiction. Star Wars is actually in the fantasy genre, more like Lord of the Rings. It's a fairy tale that just happens to be set in outer space. So for our needs this morning, Star Wars isn't going to cut it. We don't need fantasy. We need real science fiction. So step aside, Luke Skywalker. This is a job for Jean-Luc Picard. Star Trek not Star Wars, is humanity's great attempt to look at itself through the eyes of the ultimate other. It's a constant examination of, a constant grappling with what it means to be human. The Star Trekian answer to this question could be a sermon all its own. I mean, there's so much source material. Next year, Star Trek will have been with us for 50 years. The Star Trek franchise spans a dozen motion pictures, 6 television series with over 700 total episodes, countless alien life forms, each with a unique projection of, or perhaps rather a perspective of, the human race. There's the coldly rational Vulcans, the passionate and violent Klingons, the emotionally attuned and empathic Betazoids, the greed-driven hyper-capitalist Ferengi. But with the few minutes I have remaining this morning, I will choose to focus on the perspective of one particular alien race that made its debut on the TV series Star Trek: The Next Generation, TNG for my fellow Trekkers out there. In my opinion, they are the most intriguing alien race of the entire Star Trek canon. Collectively, they are known as the Continuum. The Continuum is a race of alien beings who wield nearly godlike power. The Continuum is all-powerful, seemingly all-knowing. In the very first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which aired way back in 1987, the intrepid crew of the Starship Enterprise encounters a representative of the Continuum who simply calls himself Q. Q transports the crew of the Enterprise to a courtroom, and here he informs the crew that the Continuum is placing the entire human race on trial. The charge? Committing multiple and grievous savageries, and for being a dangerous, savage child race. If found guilty, the sentence would be death of the entire species, extinction. Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Enterprise defends the human race before Q, who sits as judge, jury, and potential executioner. Picard confesses that humans do have a cruel, selfish, barbarous past, but Picard justifies our continued existence by contending that human beings have changed and will continue to change, to evolve, to become more and better. The Continuum is skeptical of this assertion, but agree to allow the crew of the Enterprise, as representatives of the entire human race, to be put to the test. Should they pass the test, the human race will be spared. The test is seeing how the crew reacts to a new mysterious alien life form, and to make a long story short, the crew shows ingenuity, wisdom, and compassion in their encounter with this mysterious alien life form. This resolution apparently appeases Q in the Continuum, and as a result, the court adjourns. 7 years later, and this is real life 7 years, in 1994, the final episode of the final season of Star Trek: The Next Generation airs. In the series finale, Captain Jean-Luc Picard magically finds himself transported once again to the same courtroom he stood in 7 years ago. Picard sees Q again in the familiar role of judge, jury, and executioner. Picard demands to know what is happening. Why is he standing before Q again? The original trial of humanity, after all, had ended in the human race's acquittal. But Q corrects the captain. Q reminds Picard, the trial never ended. We never reached a verdict. 7 years ago, I said we'd be watching you. And we have been, hoping that your ape-like race would demonstrate some growth, give some indication that your minds have room for expansion, but instead of using the last 7 years to change and to grow, you have squandered them. Q informs the captain that humanity is again to be destroyed. The rest of the episode shows Captain Picard again working to solve a mysterious puzzle set in motion by the Continuum. Ultimately, he and the Enterprise crew solve the riddle, but must also sacrifice their own lives to save the human race. And at the end of the episode, when it appears that the entire crew has died to save the galaxy, Captain Picard finds himself again in the courtroom alone with Q. Picard thanks Q for his assistance, for being given an opportunity to yet again prove humanity's worthiness to exist. He tells Q, I sincerely hope this is the last time that I find myself in this courtroom. Q responds, you just don't get it, do you, Jean-Luc? The trial never ends. We wanted to see if you had the ability to expand your mind and your horizons, And for one brief moment, you did. For that one fraction of a second, you were open to options you had never considered. That is the exploration that awaits you. Not mapping stars and studying nebulae, but charting the unknowable possibilities of existence. In Q's final words, I find a potential, compelling answer to our question this morning. What does it mean to be human? The core of our collective existence as human beings is to explore, to learn, to seek to understand, to open ourselves to new possibilities and new ideas that we cannot even imagine right now. And in that transformative process, to become more, to evolve. Human beings have an insatiable hunger to explore. Gets us into trouble sometimes. Whether that exploration takes the form of investigating our physical universe, sending probes to the very ends of our solar system and beyond, or plumbing the inner depths of the human heart, mind, and soul, we are all born explorers with an instinctive need to create meaning out of chaos, to seek truth, to understand. And if that's what humans uniquely do, then I would suggest that collectively speaking, this is humanity's most sacred act of worship. And if that is humanity's most sacred act of worship, then Unitarian Universalism, a Unitarian Universalist church, seems to me the best place to explore those deep questions and mysteries. So here we are, a community of explorers, all dedicated to searching with an open heart and an open mind, standing together in awe and wonder before the majesty of all creation. This is what makes my heart sing. And at the risk of presuming too much, the fact you're seated here this morning, I'll venture to say that this also is what makes your heart sing as well. So, may our hearts sing together. Blessed be.